What if I told you it was a tree bark? A bitter, ground-up bark that made one of the deadliest places on Earth survivable for outsiders. This is the story of how a South American fever cure didn't just treat disease, it became the ultimate enabling technology for the scramble for Africa. Without it, the map of the continent might look very different today. For centuries, Africa was known to Europeans as the white man's grave. And the primary gravedigger? Malaria. This wasn't just a disease, it was a geographical force field. A parasite carried by the Anopheles mosquito would knock out European expeditions with devastating efficiency. High fever, chills, delirium, death. It protected the interior of the continent more effectively than any army. In some regions, more than 60% of Europeans died within their first year. African societies had lived with malaria for thousands of years and developed partial immunity. Europeans had none. So for centuries, Europe could only do three things: trade from the coast, kidnap people for slavery, and then leave quickly. Deep inland colonization was simply impossible. Africa wasn't unconquered, it was unsurvivable. Now here's where the story gets interesting. In South America, indigenous people had long used the bark of a tree, the cinchona tree, to treat fever. Quinine was used as a muscle relaxant by the Quechua people, who are indigenous to Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, to halt shivering. The Quechua would mix the ground bark of cinchona trees with sweetened water to offset the bark's bitter taste, thus producing something similar to tonic water. Spanish Jesuit missionaries were the first to bring cinchona to Europe. The Spanish had observed the Quechua's use of cinchona and were aware of the medicinal properties of cinchona bark by the 1570s or earlier. Nicolas Monardes, 1571, and Juan Fragoso, 1572, both described a tree which was subsequently identified as the cinchona tree, whose bark was used to produce a drink to treat diarrhea. Inside that bark was a chemical compound. That compound was quinine, sometimes confused with quinones, but this one specific compound changed history. By the early 1800s, scientists learned how to extract and standardize quinine. For the first time in history, malaria was no longer a guaranteed death sentence. It didn't make malaria disappear, but it made it manageable. And that single change unlocked Africa every soldier, every day, like clockwork. They even mix it into their ration of gin to make it palatable, the literal birthplace of the gin and tonic. This ritual transformed European troops from vulnerable visitors into semi-malaria-resistant occupiers. The white man's grave had a chemical antidote. Think about the timeline. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers literally sat in a room and carved up Africa, happens precisely as quinine production is being perfected and militarized. This is not a coincidence. It's a prerequisite. Quinine didn't just protect soldiers, it protected the labor force needed for conquest. To extract Africa's wealth, rubber, minerals, timber, you need railways, ports, and roads. To build those, you need massive workforces of both European overseers and local laborers, all concentrated in mosquito-infested river valleys and forests. Quinine allowed for this. It made large-scale, prolonged engineering projects feasible. The very infrastructure of colonial extraction was built under a chemical umbrella. Colonization was not just about racism or greed, it was also about technology and biology. Who survives where? Who adapts? Who controls knowledge? Quinine reminds us that science is never neutral. Medicine can heal and harm, and power often follows survival. Africa wasn't behind. Africa was protected by nature until science broke that protection. So next time you hear someone say, Europe colonized Africa because Africans were weak, remember this. For centuries, Europeans couldn't even survive here. It took a bitter white powder made from indigenous adapted knowledge to open the door. This wasn't destiny, it was chemistry.